evening and welcome to the second program in our series, Reckoning, U.S. Presidents and Racial Inequality. I'm Robin von Seldeneck with the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library, and I will be serving as the moderator for this evening's event. This series has been made possible through a major grant from the National Endowment for Humanities and aims to explore the views and the political policies of individual presidents toward minority populations. We believe that these types of discussions among historians that include questions from the public are opportunities for honest conversation and reflection. We are indebted to our fellow presidential sites who partner with us on these programs. We will begin this evening with a few questions that I have prepared for our panelists, and then we will take questions from the audience. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button on your screen to type the question, and we will get to as many of those as possible. At this point, I am pleased to introduce this evening's panelist. Christina Shutt is the Executive Director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. She previously served as the Executive Director for the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center for the African American Museum of History and Culture for the state of Arkansas. Under her leadership, the center was awarded first-time National Museum accreditation, making it only the 9th Black Culture Museum in the United States to receive this distinction. Dr. Edna Greene Medford is a historian and author of Lincoln and Emancipation. Medford has degrees from Hampton University and the University of Illinois and earned a Ph.D. in history from the University of Maryland. A retired professor and former chair of the history department at Howard University, her research focus is African American history with a particular emphasis on Civil War and Reconstruction. Good evening, ladies. It's so nice to have you with us this evening.
Good evening. Hello, thank you to see you.
I thought we would start this evening by taking a look at who President Lincoln really was. Tell us a little bit about Lincoln, his upbringing, his childhood, early adulthood. What was there to make him go on to be the President of the United States at such a pivotal time in our country?
Which one of us should start?
You know what, Edna, do you mind just starting?
I'll defer to Dr. Dr. Greene Medford, please.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Well, Lincoln was probably the quintessential 19th century American, a man who truly did pull himself up by his own bootstraps, born into poverty, into a family with a father who was very hardworking, but uneducated and didn't really understand the value of an education, perhaps couldn't afford to understand the value of an education because they were on the frontier and they were very, very poor. But Lincoln was someone who had a great deal of curiosity as a child and certainly as an adult, and he had a great deal of ambition. I think sometimes we still think of him as a country bumpkin, someone who sort of just blundered into the highest office in the land, and that's not the case. This is a man who was extremely ambitious and who sort of prepared himself for what he came to be. I remember the old saying that opportunity dances with those who are already on the dance floor. Well, Lincoln made certain that he was on the dance floor. So he was at the right place at the right time.
Okay. Well, thank you. I also want to ask a little bit about, and Dr. Medford, I'll follow up this question with you as well, about what was life like in Illinois prior to the Civil War? I think sometimes there's an assumption there were no slaves there, but that's really not true, correct?
Absolutely. Illinois was supposed to be a free state, and it was to a point, but there were laws in place that made it possible for slavery to exist in the state. So there were salt works in the southern part of the state, and it was legal to have enslaved laborers there. And there was a law that made it possible for slaveholders to domicile their enslaved population in the state as long as it didn't go beyond 9 months. They couldn't have them there for a year or longer. And so what happened, though, is slaveholders from the states bordering Illinois just decided that they were going to bring their enslaved laborers in, and they were going to keep them there for as long as they wished to. And so, yes, slavery absolutely did exist in Illinois, even though it was supposed to be a free state.
Okay. Thank you. Christina, if I can ask you a little bit about what you're doing at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. How do you navigate the complexity of someone like Abraham Lincoln, a 19th century man, and bring him into the 21st century?
Well, I think for us, it's really important that we're telling that whole and complete story. And so in everything that we try to do, we don't try to whitewash or try to sanitize it in any way, but we tell the story of Lincoln and we tell the story of Illinois in such a way that tries to really capture sort of what was going on at the time, understanding and contextualizing for people. Other views, we put together lots of resources for folks where we're talking about not just Lincoln's views on race, but we're also talking about what were other Illinoisans thinking about it at the same time? What were they thinking about slavery? How were they allowing these things to happen in the state? So really telling this more kind of well-rounded story. I think oftentimes one of the misconceptions people have about folks in the past is we think that people have to be good or bad. And that they can't be both and. They can't, make both good decisions and make both bad decisions, just like we do today. And so, if anything, I think taking that approach really helps to humanize Lincoln in a way. I think it helps us to understand that, as Dr. Greene Medford said so well, that he was a person at the right place at the right time. And so much of his story is about that. And that we have the opportunity, right, to be people at the right place in the right time, to make responsible decisions. So,
I will tell you that when people register, we give them the opportunity to ask questions. And so we've had a few come in already, and then I see we already have a question tonight. And one that I have heard a lot when people were trying to understand Lincoln is the whole concept of his support for colonization. And I wondered if I could ask you to talk a little bit about the American Colonization Society. How common was that? What was their practice? What was the backstory of that?
Yeah, the American Colonization Society was founded in 1816, and it was an unusual organization, actually, because it drew membership from slaveholders and from abolitionists, and they were there working together, but for different purposes. Of course, the slaveholders were there because they felt that to have a large free Black population in the midst of enslaved people was not advantageous to slavery, because that free Black population showed enslaved people what was possible, that they could get their freedom. And of course, the abolitionists were there because they thought very naively that if you could convince slaveholders that there was some place that free Black people could go if they decided that they were going to abolish slavery, then they wouldn't mind doing it. And of course, that was just totally wrong. But the society was formed to get free Blacks out of the country, whether it was, the abolitionists doing it or the slaveholders, but with the two having a different purpose. It never was popular with African Americans in the history of that organization. And in the period, if we're looking at the period between 1820 and 1860, there are only about 10 to 12,000 people who actually go, for instance, Liberia. The society had formed a colony in Liberia. And so they were never able to convince many African Americans to leave the country of their birth and go to Liberia. These people were not, for the most part, were not African born. They were American born. Their parents and grandparents and siblings and just their ancestors had tilled the soil in America, and their blood and sweat and tears stained the soil in this country, and they saw no reason to leave.
Thank you. I did have a question come in that kind of goes with the question I had asked earlier about Illinois. And the question is, if Illinois was a free state, then how was slavery allowed? What was the point of being free if slavery was actually permitted? So I'll ask either of you who wants to respond to that distinction, because that is a difficult one. You know, we have this assumption that free means free, and that no one there would have been under the rules of slavery.
Yeah, and free never means free. I mean, even those who are free by law are not truly free, because they're having to pay a bounty to bond to live in the state. There is a time by the 1840s when the state is passing a law that says, if you're Black, you're not welcome here. You know, you cannot migrate to this area, whether you are a runaway enslaved person or you are a free person, we don't want you here. And so there are many, many instances as well where there are areas, especially in the Midwest, where the laws say you cannot have slavery, but slavery still does exist. In Illinois, though, they found ways around it. There were all of these loopholes. And then the idea, you've got the salt works in the South. There needs to be labor. Why not use enslaved labor, they're thinking. And so, you know, you've got politicians who are willing to go along with that to stay in power.
Yeah, I mean, one of the last known cases of emancipation in Illinois happens in 1863. So you think about it, I mean, that's in the middle of the Civil War, when, you know, again, Illinois is sort of supposed free state. I think one of the other things that maybe highlights this is if we think about the story of Elizabeth Keckley, who was a dressmaker, seamstress, and becomes a confidant, really, for Mary Lincoln. You know, she was a woman who purchased her freedom and the freedom of her son using the work that she did in making dresses for these women. But she, you know, leaves St. Louis and she moves to DC, and even in Washington, DC, right, she has to have other white people vouch for her and for her work before she's able to make a living. So she had to have white people in St. Louis, you know, vouch for her work. And I think that in some ways highlights, you know, in a single person's life, but some of the challenges that free Blacks face, that, you know, as Dr. Medford said, free didn't always really mean free, right? The taxes that they had to pay, the ways in which their movements were tracked, the ways in which they could be targeted, or even in Illinois' case, you know, we have very strong evidence that suggests that there were people in Illinois who were engaged in kidnapping free Blacks and relocating them, moving them to the South, deep into the heart of chattel slavery. And so, you know, again, it's this history is a lot more complex and complicated than our textbooks often paint it as.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for addressing those. And so I think another question that I would like to ask is the evolution of Lincoln's thinking toward, you know, I'm jumping ahead quite a bit now. He's president of the United States. He is getting ready to do probably the most well-known speech in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation. What led to that? How did he evolve to see the need to free all slaves?
Well, first of all, Lincoln was an anti-slavery man, but not an abolitionist before the war came, and he had to sort of adjust his thinking fairly quickly. Lincoln, I think, firmly believed in the right of all men and women to be able to improve themselves, to advance themselves to the point that they could, to the level of their capabilities. And he knew that slavery could not allow that for a whole race of people. So he certainly believed that slavery should end, but not immediately. He was not, all of that anxious to see slavery end overnight. So it's ironic that he issues the proclamation, which is an attempt, or at least it is a promise of freedom. But in terms of abolitionism, he didn't think much of the abolitionists. If you look at his what he does with Dan Stone in the Illinois legislature in 1837, where the legislature is trying to determine whether or not Illinois should go along with what's happening, in the East, where they've got this debate about whether or not abolition should occur. And so what Lincoln is saying is that the slavery is wrong, but the abolitionists are part of the problem as well, because they are inciting people. They're getting people all upset. So maybe they should be quieter. But Lincoln does come to, he believes that slavery will end naturally, that the founders actually didn't put the word slave or slavery in the Constitution because they saw slavery as a cancer. And if you just cut it out, overnight, then you're going to hurt the body, the national body. And so you have to plan for it to die a natural death. So if you contain it, and if you don't allow it to expand, then it will die naturally. But when the war comes, Lincoln realizes that slavery has been the problem that has been dividing the country for decades and decades, from the very beginning of the founding of the nation, actually. And he realizes that the war is going to drag on unless he does something about slavery, but he is not going to say all enslaved people are free through the Emancipation Proclamation. He's saying those that are still in the states in rebellion are free, and even not all of those. There's some instances where he's saying, well, no, this is not going to apply to certain groups of people in these states. But he realizes that he doesn't have much of a choice. If he's going to save the Union, he has to take this step. Now, not everybody would have done that. Other people would have gambled, that they would have, been able to bring the Union back together without touching slavery. Lincoln realizes that this is not going to happen, and he takes the gamble. He does it. And I think we need to give him credit for having the courage to do that.
Absolutely. He very much has this sort of measured approach that he tries to, in some ways, walk this fine line between sort of both sides of the equation to some extent for quite a while.
So we have quite a few questions that are coming in now, and I'm going to go ahead and mention or ask a couple that really do touch on what we're discussing. And one is, do you see anything in Lincoln's attitudes towards slavery that puzzles you today? And that may have already been answered in the previous question.
Yeah, I do. I would have hoped that he would have tried to do something about slavery earlier than he did. 11 states had seceded from the country. And in his speech, he's saying, oh, I'm not going to do anything with these domestic institutions. We're going to uphold the Fugitive Slave Act because I still see these states as being part of the Union because they cannot legally secede. But at the time he's saying that, there are Black people who are leaving the plantations and they're trying to get their freedom. And even if he was not willing to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, he could have simply said, let them go. If they can get to the North, let them stay, let's free those. But he doesn't do that. He is so conciliatory to the South, even when the South is showing that it's not interested in playing ball with him. So it takes him a while to get to that point. There are people who lost their lives along the way. And so I'm still a little upset that that's happening.
I think for me, one of the things that really does kind of bother me is that Lincoln loved minstrelsy. He loved this, very racist and derogatory form of entertainment. If you are familiar with the story of Lincoln at the end of the war asking the band to play Dixie, right? It's not just as sort of a conciliatory measure to the South, but it's also because Lincoln loved the song. He loved minstrel songs. He went to minstrel shows. And so, for someone who we think about as kind of the, mythologized as the great emancipator, as someone who, while he probably never really saw equality with Blacks, he at least could appreciate certain, Black men, right? In his thinking and his willingness to meet with them. But he also really loved things that were horrific and that were detrimental to Black people and to people, to our nation being able to heal, right? To see Black people as equal to those of white. So,
yeah, he was a 19th century white man with Southern sensibilities. I think we forget sometimes just because he lived his adult life in Illinois doesn't mean that he didn't have Southern attitudes. There were lots of folk in Illinois who had Southern attitudes. There were lots of Southerners who moved to Illinois. So Lincoln really, the thing about him is, despite all of that, he was still able to do the right thing.
A couple of people have asked if one or both of you would be willing to discuss a little more the relationship between Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. It's a very interesting relationship there. Would either of you care to discuss that?
If I may start, I don't think they had all that much of a relationship. I said once, unless you're inviting me over to your house for a Sunday dinner, don't consider me a friend, okay? And certainly they had, there was an acquaintance, but keep in mind that two men only met 3 times in their lives, in 1863, in 1864, and in 1865 at the reception for the second inauguration. I think that we put too much emphasis on Douglas's influence on Lincoln. I'm not so sure that's the case. I think there may have been other people who were more influential that Lincoln was listening to. It doesn't mean that he didn't know about Douglas, because he did. I don't know that he actually read Douglas's editorials or he knew anything about his speeches. But I think that we can, just because I think Douglas is responsible for us thinking that there was a real relationship, because Douglas was very proud of how Lincoln treated him when he was at the White House. And he should be. This is a person who was formerly enslaved, and he's being hosted by the most important man in the country. So he had a right to be proud of himself. But I think we can put too much emphasis on the relationship. Now, we do have to remember, though, that Mrs. Lincoln gave Douglas one of Lincoln's favorite canes after he was assassinated. But even so, I think it was a very fleeting friendship. And even though Lincoln had treated him so well when he came to the White House in 63, that doesn't mean that Douglas was ready to support him wholeheartedly when he was running for the presidency again in 64. In fact, there was a period of time there when Douglas said, wait a second, he needs to be doing more.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, Douglas was good at holding Lincoln accountable, and even holding his legacy accountable. When they're dedicating the monument that formerly enslaved people have paid for, but not gotten the opportunity to design. Douglas is at that dedication, and he basically says in front of, the kind of, if you think about the leadership of the U.S. government who's there at this dedication, that, you are his children, but we are Lincoln's stepchildren, and really calling them to task and saying, what are you going to do to protect free, newly freed Blacks in the South? And so if anything, Douglas really has this relationship of, I think about it as a relationship being more about Douglas pushing, right? And continuing to think about the ways in which we're actually honoring Lincoln's legacy.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And that leads me to another question, and that is, as Lincoln's views were evolving, who did he rely on or consult with? Were there any fellow politicians or authors that he consulted with as he moved forward?
As radical as Charles Sumner was, and Lincoln was no radical, I think that he did rely on Sumner quite a bit, at least from the perspective of the race question. Sumner was much more progressive than Lincoln ever was, but and certainly Lincoln would not have agreed with Sumner on everything, but Sumner sort of kept him aware of things that he needed to be aware of. And so I think he's getting some guidance there, but he's getting guidance from his friends in Illinois as well. Some of them who are very conservative people. They may be Republicans, but they were certainly conservative. Some would have preferred that he tried to end the war sooner than it did, that he tried to compromise. And especially after he issued the proclamation, there was a great deal of pushback from his friends.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I echo all that, and then add that I think that I like to believe that he also spoke with people who were working in the White House, that, while they might not have had a sort of friendly relationship, that Lincoln was probably, maybe a little more approachable. And, we know that he spoke with or had some relationship in terms of through Mary with, like I said, Elizabeth Keckley. And that's part of the reason the Lincolns decided to donate money for the Contraband Slave Society, right? So we would have had some interaction with folks through that as well.
That leads me to another question. This was a question that came in during registration. And that question is, why did Lincoln choose Andrew Johnson to serve as his vice president?
To keep the Union together. I mean, really, that's what it was about, right? It was about picking someone in a border state to help keep the Union together. And I will say, I give Lincoln credit for thinking about what the country would be like, right? Imagining a life post-war, that he had that, right? But maybe not the best choice for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, well, you had, Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee, and he had remained loyal when his state left the Union. And so they're trying to, they're reestablishing this union-based government in Tennessee. And so he's really rewarding the folk, especially in Eastern Tennessee, where they had remained loyal. I agree, it was not a good pick at all. But then no one expected that Johnson would become president. I think if Lincoln had known that there was that possibility, he might have looked elsewhere.
That's a very good point. So how much of a role did Mrs. Lincoln play in serving as an advisor to her husband?
So, before Lincoln comes into the White House, she is a key advisor for him. They would often talk about politics of the day. That was one of the reasons I like to think that their courtship, right, and why they why they end up getting married is because that's one of the things he really loves about her. She has, I believe, close to 11 years of formal education. Mm-hmm. She went to boarding school. She, I believe, spoke French and maybe even Latin. So very highly educated compared to, Lincoln and his, lack of, I think, not even really a full year of formal schooling, right? And so the fact that they could talk and to dialogue together about these topics. Now, of course, once they go to DC, that relationship changes because Lincoln now has, some of the top men in the country as his advisors. And Mary really struggles to not have that role anymore. And it's interesting, even the way that we sort of perceive or think about Mary, right, are often in the midst of those struggles of a woman who's trying to be seen and to be heard, but not getting that from, you know, those around her or her spouse at times.
Yeah, can you imagine how difficult it must have been for a woman like her? If Lincoln was ambitious, she was doubly so. But she was limited in what she could do because she was a woman and she was not allowed to participate in politics on the same level that men were. And so she seemed to pour all of her ambition, all of that energy into her husband. And she had such confidence that he could succeed. And so his success comes, at least in part, from what she did during the marriage. I don't see their marriage as a negative thing. They were probably ideal for each other. We may not see it, but clearly there was something there. They complemented each other, I think.
That's a very, very valid point. I think there really was a good complementary relationship there. We do have quite a few more questions, but I don't want to forget a piece of this dialogue and this conversation we're having tonight is how are presidential libraries and presidential sites dealing with this. I love how you said it, Christina, the both and. One of the questions that was asked as part of registration is it challenging to look back in time and form judgments on past behaviors? And I asked that of both of you, but Christina, I do want to start with you.
Well, you know, it's one of those things of we're always looking through those lenses, right? Whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, we're always thinking about the world in whatever lens we're wearing. So we can say for all we want to that we're not really judging the past, but we are always judging the past, right? We're always judging and thinking about the decisions that people made or they didn't make, the choices that they had or didn't have, right? Part of the reason I probably give more grace to Mary than maybe other historians have is because I think about what it's like to be a woman in leadership. And if I didn't have the agency or the authority that I do, right? And so I'm always wearing those lenses when we think about the past. You know, I think from an interpretation point, one of the more challenging things we have is to help the public think about it that way, because we want our historical figures to be on these nice, neat little pedestals where they did perfect things all the time. And that's just not the world that they lived in. That's not who they were. And so to be able to really tell a more holistic story and to not shy away from that, but to be really honest about that, I think is always something that we're thinking about and working through and trying to be better at. You know, one of the things, for example, that we've been kind of tossing around here and thinking about is I was really struck. I was reading a Lincoln document. And he was talking about, he never referred to Jefferson Davis as the Confederate president. He always talked about him as the insurgent leader. And, you know, it's something, again, that we're thinking about of what would it look like to change the word instead of saying and giving him an authority or place that he didn't have in Lincoln's own time, that Lincoln himself didn't recognize. What would it look like to use the word insurgent leader when we talk about things? Would that help us to understand what you know, the sort of loosely defined, the Confederacy, right? The insurgency was, right? Because that's a modern word that we understand.
Yeah, I know that we're sometimes criticized for looking at the 19th century through 21st century eyes. And as historians, we're not supposed to do that, but we are human beings and we bring certain baggage to the table when we study history. You know, I've heard so frequently, well, if Lincoln told racially insensitive jokes, lots of folk in the 19th century told racially insensitive jokes. Well, lots of people didn't too. So we can't just dismiss it. It is a part of who Lincoln was. And I think we need to address it head on. Does that make him an evil person? No, but it does make him a human being. And I think that when we try to just gloss over some of the negatives, we do a disservice to him. He was someone who was very complex, and that's why he's so interesting to study. If he was boring old Andrew Johnson, no one would want to study him. There wouldn't be 16,000 plus books about him. So it's difficult when you read some of the things he did and some of the things he didn't do. And yeah, my 21st century attitude will come to play in my interpretations of Lincoln. But I hope that I keep a balanced view of the man because of that complexity.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question that came in was, how do we talk about past presidents in general and get past today's labels, the bias of the left or the right, Democrat, Republican? How do we deal with that as historians, as we look at who these presidents were? And that's a question I get asked often, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think we have to first start with truth telling, right? Just telling the truth, being honest about that truth, and telling it in a way that acknowledges the past and the sort of thinking about it as whatever happened, right? One of our I don't know if it's people's favorite gallery here in the museum, but one of the galleries that we have is this, what we call the Whispering Gallery, where it's this kind of disorienting experience of you walking through and you see all these different political cartoons and people gossiping overhead, talking about Lincoln and how much they hated Lincoln. And for some folks who come here, that room is a huge shock to them because they assume that Lincoln was this beloved figure in his time. And in fact, what you learn is that he wasn't, that people loved him, but people also really didn't like him at all. That in many ways, Lincoln, when he takes over, when he becomes president, Southern states had already seceded, right? That he wasn't actually on the ballot in any Southern state, that the vote was split so much that he really only won like half of the Northern states, right? So he's really taking over at a very divided time in American history. And that we've always had this sort of political divisions and the political divisiveness, and that's not a new thing to our modern era. The way in which we do it and some of the disinformation around it might be a little bit different, but at the same time, they might not have had Twitter in 1860, but they were still saying negative things, right, about presidents.
I agree. Getting as close as we can to the truth is what the task of the historian should be. We are supposed to be objective, and we try to be, to the extent that a human being can be. We are human beings. But I think, yes, if you start with trying to understand, trying to identify the truth, and then trying to interpret why things happened, not so much that they did, but why they did, and why during this period of time. I think the role of the historian is to look at the past so that we know why we're doing the things we're doing today. And perhaps if we can get closer to the truth, we'll be able to help ourselves now to get through some of these issues that we're facing.
Well, and part of that truth, frankly, for all of our presidents is that they did not do things in a vacuum, that they weren't
Absolutely.
these sort of lone warrior, great white saviors who were doing things for America, but that they had advisors, that they had people around them, that they were overhearing conversations, they were considering all sorts of things, and they were impacted by those things. And so, part of that truth telling is both, the truth telling itself, but also acknowledging that they were part of these communities and that they were doing things shaped both by the things they saw and heard and also the things they didn't see and hear.
Absolutely.
Well, that leads me to another question that came in. And I know this is hard as a historian, that we sometimes are asked, what would so-and-so think today? but I do think it's worth asking. What do you think Lincoln would be most surprised or disappointed by about race relations in America today?
Yeah, it's fun. You know, the counterfactual history can be really fun, but I think that he would be disappointed. He on the one hand, he would be pleased that we have come as far as we have, but on the other, he would be disappointed that after more than a century and a half, we're fighting some of the same issues we were fighting in the post-Civil War era. That's a long time not to have come to some resolution. I think he would be very concerned that the nation seems to be moving backwards, not seems to be, is moving backwards in terms of race relations. He was concerned about whether or not white men and Black men could coexist in the country. That's one of the reasons why he supported colonization, because he believed that all people should be able to govern themselves. And he didn't think that Black people would get a fair shot in doing that in this country. But of course, by the end of the war, he was recommending voting rights for certain groups of Black men, which suggests that he was changing his opinion about that. But yeah, I think he would be very disappointed at where we are. And especially he would be disappointed that democracy is under attack. This is a man who believed so strongly in democratic institutions. I mean, that was his whole reason for being. And it's like there's a segment of the nation that has turned its back on democracy. And I think he would absolutely be demoralized by that.
You know, echoing that, I would say that, you know, he would probably be pretty horrified to see what happened on January 6th, to see a, you know, armed mob, to see Confederate flags in the US Capitol, even to see them as bumper stickers. I think, again, he would have been really bothered by that, right? About the ways in which, you know, there's a segment of the population, right, that seeks to move back, to increase the divisions, because he did believe in democracy and he believed in the unification of country. He believed in, you know, technology. So even to see the ways that we have divisions over technology, you know, as it tries to improve people's lives, I think he would have been really bothered by that, and really sort of aghast, right, at some of the discussions that we've had lately.
An interesting question. Do we know of Lincoln ever commenting publicly or even privately to his associates about the Dred Scott decision?
Well, we do. I mean, Lincoln was appalled by that decision, as were most Americans who were in the know. Well, at least if they were in the North. The South was very pleased with it, but there were many who were not. And certainly Lincoln and his friends would have been very much against it, because what the Dred Scott decision did was, it didn't just say Black people were not citizens of the states and the United States, which was bad enough, but it said that slaveholders could take their enslaved laborers anywhere they wished to, because they were property, and the Constitution protected the rights of property. And so Lincoln and Northerners who believed that slavery had to be contained were absolutely appalled that the Dred Scott decision, that decision came down the way it did. It's one of the several things during the 1850s that brought the nation closer to war. But I think probably that one more than anything else did. We've got John Brown and his raid, but before that, you know, with Dred Scott, that just tore the nation apart.
Well, and it's one of the things that really, I think, encourages Lincoln to begin making political speeches again, to reconsider a political future where he had sort of thought maybe that wasn't going to happen in the way that he thought it was going to happen. But he begins making speeches against the Dred Scott decision because he is so bothered by how the courts have interpreted it.
Thank you. Can either of you share with us a little bit of the firsthand experiences that Lincoln would have had in seeing the ravages of slavery? I know at the Presidential Library and Museum, there's the auction block exhibit, and just follow up on that a little bit. And what were the thoughts there?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to be on that first panel. There were two panels that were pulled together to discuss the themes for the museum. And I was on the first panel. And I remember distinctly the day we discussed the horrors of slavery and how that would be presented. And, I think that we have a tendency to want to see the violence. I remember someone saying, well, the guy with the scarred back, the slave with the scarred back, that gives an indication, a very visual indication of what slavery was. And I remember saying, no, that's horrific enough. But the horrible thing about slavery was the separation of families. And so there should be an exhibit with those I see them as traitors, as people who are coming in and separating a family. And I am proud to say that I am the owner of the design drawing for that exhibit. It hangs in my family room, and it's a great topic of conversation when people come to visit. But it is truly about what it does to destroy the family. Yes, there's the horrific violence, there's the exploitation of labor, but the division, the separation of families was just horrific, with children being separated from their parents and husbands from their wives. These people never saw each other again in many instances. So imagine a mother who is separated from her children and she never sees them again. And the Civil War, the end of the war, you've got African Americans on the roads, and the roads are clogged with formerly enslaved people. And initially, people were writing, well, they're lazy, they don't want to work, that's why they're on the roads. No, they were on the roads because they were trying to reestablish their families. They were trying to find out where their loved ones had been sold away to. And so to me, that's the real horror of slavery. And I think that that's what Lincoln realized as well. He certainly knew about all of the other stuff, but he had even, well, allegedly, he had told someone about the auction block scene that he had seen when he was in New Orleans. So I suspect that did have a tremendous impact on him.
So had Lincoln not been assassinated, how do you think Reconstruction and our subsequent history would have been different?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, I think there's part of us, right? The optimistic side of us that wants to believe things would have been different, but maybe they wouldn't have been different, right? Maybe things would have been the exact same. I mean, Lincoln's considering, the last sort of public speech he makes, right? It's about him considering granting the right to vote to intelligent, we think probably means literate slaves, formerly enslaved people who had fought. So these soldiers and, those who were literate. But of course, that doesn't necessarily include women at this point. Mm-hmm. And that discussion, right, that happens afterward regarding suffrage and regarding the rights of women and who we're going to allow to vote and whether that will include gender or just race, right? Those are important discussions that happen afterward. That maybe those discussions don't happen in the same way if Lincoln is there, right? If they just decide, okay, well, if you're illiterate and Black, you can vote. And that becomes the end of the dialogue. So, I don't know.
Well, I think that Lincoln sort of gives us an inkling of how he might have behaved. All we have to do is look at the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. And that's a little early. That's not, the war has not ended. He's doing this in the middle of the war. But and his 10% plan, those are not revolutionary kinds of actions. These are rather conservative. He's trying to be conciliatory. He's tired. This war has worn him out, and he wants the country to be healed. I don't think the 14th and 15th Amendments would have occurred as early as they did had Lincoln survived. I think the only reason why they occurred when they did was because you had a very weak president, and you had more radical people in Congress who were determined that they were going to keep the South in check. And if Lincoln had been there, I think he would have been too strong for the more radical people to have been able to get those Reconstruction amendments passed. The 13th, yes, I think, well, we know Lincoln supported that wholeheartedly by 1864. But the 14th and 15th, I'm sure he would have supported them, but I think he would have been so busy trying to appease the South, trying to bring some kind of unity back to the nation.
Thank you. I've had a couple of questions here that I do want to ask, and one is, as we look to the future and we hope for a better future, what can we take from Lincoln in the process of moving forward that would help us create a more perfect, better union today?
Well, I think what he's done is he's left a legacy that, but before Lincoln, I think the country loved to talk about freedom and equality, but never really defined it except in custom. And in custom, it didn't include women. It didn't include the Native population. It certainly did not include Black people, enslaved or free. I think that with the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation and then the 13th Amendment and the war that made all of this possible, I think the nation now, the expectation has been since then that America has to be inclusive. Now, it hasn't always been there, we know. We know that in the post-Reconstruction era, things go downhill. We know that there's a long fight during the 20th century, and it looks like we're moving back to that fight again. The whole idea of voting rights being attacked, and people actually losing the right to vote in this country, the kinds of laws that are being passed now, I think that we are moving away from that legacy. And so we're moving in the wrong direction. And so we need to go back to where we took a wrong turn during Reconstruction or right after Reconstruction. And I think we need to go back and pick up and take the, take the direction that's going to bring us to a more inclusive society. Lincoln didn't believe that we could reach perfection, but he believed that we needed to get as close to it as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, he believed in, again, that core word, right? We the people, right? In order to form a more perfect union. And so, the idea of striving together with, everyone being able to have a vote, with, feeling safe in their home and in their personhood, right? All of those kinds of things are things that I think, I hope, right? As Edna said, right, I hope we'll be able to turn back towards the right direction. So we'll be able to understand the value and the importance of citizenship to a healthy democracy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I did have one of our viewers say that there's a current exhibit right now on Reconstruction at the African American Smithsonian Museum, the Museum of African American History. So a great, if you have not had a chance to go there, I strongly encourage anyone to take the time. And it does take a good bit of time to go through and to really process. That's not something you can go through in 2 hours and think you've seen it all by any means. So thank you for that reminder. Another attendee is asking if there's a particular biography or history that you think does the best job of portraying and interpreting the topic of Lincoln and slavery.
Oh, I'm going to, what is the word? I'm going to toot my own horn, okay? I did a book, a very small book, in 2015, I guess it was, called Lincoln and Emancipation. It's about 112 pages. It's a part of the Concise Lincoln Library series out of Southern Illinois University Press. It's a series of books. I guess they must have about 30 titles now. Lincoln and Emancipation, Lincoln and the law, Lincoln and immigration, and so forth. And I concentrated on slavery and emancipation. And I think it's a useful read as a start. There are so many other books, though, that are so much more in depth. But if you wanted to just start looking at a book about Lincoln and slavery from the perspective of African Americans, which is something that's not often done. It's always about Lincoln's policies, but it's like African Americans are just sort of an afterthought. They're on the sidelines. And I tried to make African Americans central to the story. And it has been, it's in paperback. So.
Well, since I got to pick her book, which is an excellent read, I'll pick sort of two other ones that she didn't write, but I think are also good. One is it's actually a book called They Knew Lincoln, and it was published by a man named John Washington. It's been republished. I believe Kate Masser was the editor on the newer volume, but it tells, again, the perspective of Lincoln from Black people who were living and working in Washington, D.C. It was probably one of, if not the earliest title from Black people's perspective about Lincoln. So I'll recommend that one. I'll also recommend The Fiery Trial by Eric Foner, which I think is a classic when you're thinking about sort of Lincoln and slavery and his changing views. So
I agree wholeheartedly. Those are wonderful books.
Well, I am just shocked at how quickly the time has gone by, and we have several more questions. And I'm going to ask a couple more, but being mindful of the time, I feel like we just started. It's been just such an interesting conversation to be having this evening. But I do have a question. One of our viewers asks, would Lincoln have approved of Grant leaving federal troops in the South? And also, would he then have agreed with the compromise in 1876, removing them to allow Hayes to become president?
Yeah, in terms of the troops in the South, I think that Lincoln would have approved it under certain circumstances. And of course, what we know is happening is at the end of the war, the former Confederates are trying to regain control, and they do regain control. And they're not just abusing the formerly enslaved, but they are abusing people who come to help the formerly enslaved as well. And they are finding their way back into Congress. And so Lincoln would have been the leader of the Republican Party. And I don't think he would have been too pleased with these folk having been so responsible for the war and the loss of 750,000 people. I don't think he would have been willing to just have a slap on the wrist once they started doing what they actually did. Certainly earlier than that, he trusted that they would do the right thing. I don't know why, but he did. But I think seeing what was transpiring in the South, Lincoln would have approved that. And the other one, what was the other? Oh, the 1876 compromise. I'm not so sure that he would have approved that. I think he would have seen that as rather as undemocratic. I think he would have had problems with it.
Okay, thank you. Interestingly enough, we are covering grant next month in our series, and that is also on March 10th. And that'll be at 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock Eastern. So we will look at Grant from the perspective of as our president. So I hope everyone will be able to attend that. The final question that I want to ask is really just not really a question. It's an opportunity for Christina to share with us a little more about the great work that's happening at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. And of course, Edna has been very involved in the formation of that wonderful facility. So I do want to have an opportunity for you to just share a little bit about what's happening there, any future plans looking forward.
Well, what we're really kind of focused on in this season is, of course, our new mission statement, which is to inspire civic engagement through the diverse lens of Illinois history and sharing with the world the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. And that update really comes as, the Library Museum is trying to be more responsive to our community's needs for civic engagement, for dialogue, for exploring the past. And so we're doing that through lots of programs. If you go to our website, presidentlincoln.illinois.gov, you can see the full list of things we're doing, including a program next week, actually on Emmett Till, and then the following week, we'll be doing a program with Tamika Nunley, who will be talking about Black women in DC during and before the Civil War. So that should be interesting. But we're really trying to shine a light and amplify stories that don't get talked about. We spend so much time, as I talked about earlier, talking about Lincoln, that we miss all of the people who are sort of in that shadow space, who were instrumental to Lincoln's story. And so we're really trying to amplify that and amplify those diverse stories here. One of the projects we're working on that people will probably see first is actually one to update the language in some of our labels, particularly around Mary Lincoln. So, right now, the language that we use talks about Mary Lincoln from a very gossipy, kind of negative perspective. And one of the things we're trying to do is to tell her story, as a grieving mother, but also as a woman who is trying to flex some of her political muscle, trying to, help where she can. And so talking about the story of women is something that we're kind of keenly working on at addressing, in addition to hopefully a new children's gallery later this year, maybe the first of next year, focused on teaching children about citizenship and democracy. So a lot of projects here and there, but it's an exciting time to be talking about Lincoln and thinking about him.
Thank you very much. We are so appreciative to both of you for joining us this evening for this conversation. I feel like we're just at the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more that could be said and that we could be discussing. And for those who did not have their questions answered, it was just a couple, I believe, at this point, we will reach out to you about those questions and try to get those answered for you. I want to thank everyone who has tuned in this evening for this presentation. We really appreciate your support as we do this program. We encourage you to share this with other individuals. We think that it's a very important conversation for us to be having. Last month, we did the same with President Andrew Jackson. And if you missed that, please go to our website where you can see a recording of that conversation. And a reminder, we will be meeting 1 month from tonight to talk about Grant. So we hope you'll be able to join us then. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. On behalf of the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library, thank you for tuning in.